Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bach. I'm here today with one of my new favorite authors, Jonathan Leaf. He's a playwright and now a novelist and mystery writer. Jonathan, can you tell us a little about yourself, your new book, and what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, as you mentioned, my reputation is as a playwright, and I guess the thing that provoked the most attention or prompted the most attention was a play I wrote about Alexander Pushkin, which the Wall Street Journal picked as one of the 4 best plays of 2018. And I've been nominated for various awards as a playwright, best off-Broadway play of the year, that kind of thing. I've had plays done here in the United States, in France, elsewhere. And this is the first novel I've had published, and we seem to be getting very good reviews. Mostly people seem to really enjoy it, just as a fun read. People are comparing it a lot to Elmore, Leonard, and Hiaasen. Writers who really write to entertain. And that was the goal in writing the book. But also, I spent some time in Los Angeles, which the city I've come to really like, but I think people writing about it don't really get it right. So the aim was to write an entertaining novel that describes what life really is like in Los Angeles, particularly for people on the margins of the entertainment industry, people who are not entirely successful. And it's a mystery, and, I'd work in entertainment. I don't know what else to say. Those are the main things.
Right. So I own a copy. I'm just going to show it to people. Not my copy. I should have brought mine upstairs with me, but let's see. Here's your book, City of Angles, and I just had this little experience where everyone Google keeps trying to autocorrect it to City of Angels. So when you're looking for it, make sure you spell it with the pun in mind, City of Angles. So Los Angeles, as many people. And here's kind of a few short reviews. I'll let people pause this if they want, and they can read those, or just go to Amazon and look for it and buy it. I actually own 2 copies because at different junctures I wanted to promote you, and I guess one I had done in way early pre-order, and such is the nature of the beast that when it was coming out, I wanted to have a copy, so I ordered it again. So I have one through Barnes & Noble, one through Amazon. So if you're listening out there and you live anywhere near me, or you want to pay for postage, I'll be happy to gift a copy. I can't have it signed unless we can work out something virtually right now. So I do have an extra copy, and I'm happy. Frankly, I have the copy I read, so maybe 2. So I recommend it. I'll tell you my quick impression of it. What I really liked about it were the business interactions and the way the business kind of blurs into the personal. And there's a fair amount of conniving and playing. The commodity of an actor is him or herself, I suppose, and the modulation has to be of that as well. And acting is living and breathing, but under, I guess, prisms or constraints. And I think an interesting part of the book for me is the way this plays into some of the way the actors in the mystery are acting or not acting. So when somebody comes into police custody, is that person a good actor or a bad actor, telling the truth or whatever? And I think the police are somewhat mystified, probably in general, with the denizens of Hollywood's, writ large, and Hollywood, the neighborhood itself. And a lot of these interactions were, kind of power based, and not. I mean, some of the artistry that is brought up in the movie. There's a movie within the movie. It's a little bit like Hamlet, not quite, but there's kind of a play within the play that's the center of the mystery, and the way that the protagonist, I guess, tries to, get something true and bold out of what is oftentimes just kind of cookie cutter production. So. Anyway, I don't want to, this is not my review session, but what I found edifying and interesting in particular were the very fine points about how people arrange meetings, what they do in the meetings, what's the power narrative, how people use literally themselves to barter. Now, whether it's, selling their favors, themselves, their body, their sex lives, and how and when people can tell what's real and not. And so, it's an apt title because the City of Angels is probably no longer. And, there is the general mispronunciation of Los Angeles. I'm not sure people still do it. It's Los Angeles. So it is kind of redolent of that mispronunciation, kind of the distortion of what had been, for the, I'm not sure which monks they were, but the Spanish who called it literally, I forget what the beginning before Los Angeles is. You might know. But it's an interesting sociology of the city. And not the city, but the way things happen, the business in Los Angeles. And, one would have assumed you were an LA native or in, quote unquote, the industry. Harry, so that's my quick or long take on your book. I recommend it for those reasons, and we could talk about others in a little bit. I want to give you the mic.
Yeah, I should say I did not live in Los Angeles that long. When you start to get a reputation as a playwright, which I did, basically from about 2005 to 2008, I had a bunch of plays produced that got very good reviews, and started to get noticed. I've produced the last 5-6 years. There was like a drought when I was getting produced. But during that time, everyone I knew in New York who was starting to get attention to playwright basically moved and still working as a TV writer. And I wasn't making a lot of money as a playwright, though I got these wonderful reviews and, sold out productions, little productions. And so I went out to LA for about 6 months, was looking for work, and, got some exposure to what was going on and was really fascinated. And as someone who was no longer that young, not in my 20s, I really enjoyed the city in a lot of ways I wouldn't have when I was younger. And I was dating a woman who would become my wife, and she wanted me to come back to New York, and I came back to New York, and soon thereafter started getting produced again. But, I was intrigued. Whenever I picked up books or saw movies about the movie business, they never really got the details right. But particularly, they didn't get the detail. They didn't get the sense. They give you an accurate sense of what an actor's life is like. And I have so many friends who are actors that I felt this is a big part of the story. And of course, there are literally hundreds of thousands of actors in Los Angeles.
So does one make a living as a playwright? One?
It's hard. It's very difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult. It's not easy. I have not been making a consistent living at it, in spite of getting wonderful reviews. Yeah.
So does that mean
you're throwing up productions?
Does that mean you wait tables then, or what? How do things work out?
Well, it's been one thing and another, but it's nice to see this book published.
Yeah, that is. And how are things going for reviews and whatnot? Where do things?
They've been fantastic. Yeah, I think before we came on today, I was telling you, one reviewer compared it to Tom Wolfe and said, this is a direct quote, "What an entertaining book." Another reviewer said he had never read a mystery novel that went to a deeper level, meaning deeper level psychologically. And also said it should be again, direct quote, immediately turned into a movie. And said he hadn't seen anything like it since the Robert Altman movie, The Player. Yeah, the reviews have been great. We've got a whole bunch that are still to come, including Kirkus, which is sort of the industry review. Several magazine reviews that apparently are being prepared. I don't know whether they're going to be positive or not. And the feedback, as I say, we've got from people is, above all, this is a fun read. This is a really enjoyable read, and especially if you know Los Angeles or you're interested in Los Angeles, you're interested in the entertainment industry. It's a really enjoyable read. That's what I've heard. So I'm going forward for it.
So it's kind of a production in a way. I mean, people have an idea for a play to go on Broadway, and then it's a huge amount of capital accumulation, getting backers and whatnot. It's a little bit like a startup, getting venture capital and so forth. How do you keep your wind under your sails? And what are your kind of avenues? As a playwright and so forth. Tell us a little bit about the background and how you kind of navigate.
Well, I haven't had any Broadway plays. I've had both off-Broadway and off-Broadway. But I have yet to have a Broadway production. I'd love to have a Broadway production. I mean, I'm excited that, and I've been very happy to get to the level of having off-Broadway, which is it's a distinction that most people don't understand. It has to do with the contracts that you sign with the actors and the type of theater you put it on in. But I haven't had a Broadway production, if it's successful, represents an enormous amount of money.
That's what I meant. So and I wasn't trying to imply you had a Broadway show. I was just thinking that one needs, a lot of lift, kind of air under your wings to get going. And how do you navigate that from play to play? I mean, I think, from my understanding, I was just reading a review of your Deconstruction, your play named Deconstruction, about Paul de Man, or Paul de Man, however it's pronounced. And we share alma maters, or one alma mater, Yale, and he was there, and you wrote a play about it. That doesn't necessarily seem like the thing that's going to, knock the doors down at the ticket counter. And so how do you do that if you're trying to write works of intellectual heft, yet, interest and so forth? How do you carve out your audience? How do you get them to know about it? And where does this lead?
I'm trying to figure that out. I should say, by the way, I think I've had 8 plays produced now. And I would say that 7 of them, we got very good reviews and we had phenomenal audience response. I mean, sellouts. In one of them, we got phenomenal reviews and we had pretty good audience response. And that was that play about Paul de Man, maybe not an accident. It may have been too intellectual for the audience, though it had plenty of action. I mean, there's a love affair. There's the central female character has a miscarriage. There's sort of a mystery that's unraveled. And it's a relatively short play. It's only about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 15 minutes. So, I think it is a reasonably entertaining play, but that was a criticism that if we didn't actually hear it, I think was implicit. So a lot of the other plays have been, one of the first play of mine that really got attention was a hostage drama. Yeah, I mean, the hostage drama is inherently suspenseful. Another of my plays that got a lot of attention was one that had 2 duels. It's actually based on real historical events. It had 2 duels, a love affair. It was a reasonably fast-paced play. But yeah, you need it. As with this writing a novel, I think it's important to have a good story and to be a storyteller. I think that's a really underestimated aspect of writing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know you've written about science issues. Even if you're writing about science issues, it's very important to be a storyteller.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I shouldn't tell the whole world my trick, but I have ideas and I have thoughts and so forth. And sometimes, I spend most of my life as a primary care physician, and I would write every day, but I write about the individual patient. And back in medical school, I mean, I would just write what I saw. We had to write, have to write a history of a patient. And I didn't win a lot of awards in medical school, but I did well academically and whatnot. But, a few different doctors said, well, you write the best notes of anybody. I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, I'm just, he says, well, you really fleshed them out. You kind of give us a sense of what was going on there. Because I do it as a mnemonic, because if I'm going to see that patient again, I want to have a sense, not another just runny nose or a pimple on the forehead. So I mean, it's not elaborate. I'm not doing fiction, but I feel like you have to kind of give the capture. And as soon as dictation showed up, I started probably almost 30 years ago using dictation. It became very easy to give kind of a very full sweep of what person is coming in for. And sometimes the details are very useful in what they're doing in their lives, who's at home, what kind of relationships they have. And so, when you see that person the next time, there's a continuity. I as a patient, I'm getting older, and I see some doctors now, and and I've also done some urgent care work more recently. A lot of the EMRs, the medical records, are very reductionist, kind of press buttons. I mean, they're dialogue boxes, computer buttons and whatnot, kind of fill things in, and it's very choppy. You don't get really that sense. So I still, this is my kind of old-fashioned way of using dictation, but to fill out a story. But as far as writing stuff, I've written, a fair amount of things, pieces in the last couple of years on medical topics and ChatGPT also, but from a medical perspective. But it's hard sometimes. You have all these ideas, you want to get them all out, and you don't want to, as they say, bury the lead. You want to get things, kind of in the reverse pyramid to get, the important stuff out there and whatnot. So it's taking a little bit of focus and redirection. I think Mark Twain said, I've written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. So you have to kind of parse things and work things down. But one of the tricks that I've been doing is when I wrote my Zika book, and we'll get to that maybe at the end, there were a lot of things going on about that. And to get it into a reasonable, talkable fashion, I actually spoke it. So I hired somebody in Brazil, a young law student, to interview me repeatedly. So we had a few, I'm not sure how many, 6 or 7 1-hour sessions on different topics. And I found just kind of researching it and then having it presented in a logical way that somebody would understand. And then I would transcribe those things and I'd work those into the book. And it became, from my view, people need to buy my book. I don't know if they're going to read it, but I think a lot of the book does flow reasonably well, if I may say so myself, because it was almost, a good fraction was spoken to begin with. And so there's that kind of aspect where I think the phrase is, if you can, if you can fake humility, you have it made. But if you can, fake this kind of ease as a playwright, I assume then you have it made. How do you navigate this when you're writing your plays and novels? How do you work through the conversational parts or get things to kind of jump from page to page when you have all control?
Actually, I don't know. You want on one hand, well, they're totally different. I mean, theater moves forward based on action and speech. And a novel, you have to do a lot of description and some things that are kind of interior and psychological. So they're pretty different. But obviously there's been overlap in the sense that there have been some very good novelists who are good playwrights and good playwrights who are good novelists. But, I think we're kind of going off topic. So many of the best writers have been doctors. Chekhov, Malm, we could include Conan Doyle, actually, speaking of mystery writers. Yeah, and I don't think that's an accident. They have to, because doctors are trained to be good as they obviously they also be trained to be good observer. Yeah,
William Carlos Williams, I think, also.
Yeah, but so obviously that's part of what you're doing as well. Though you may not be aware that you're acting as the observer.
Right. So how did you get into this role? No pun intended. And where did your aspirations come from, and when did they take form?
Well, actually, Los Angeles played a role. I was in my early 20s. I went to visit some family in it wasn't actually Los Angeles, but it was Southern California. And while I was out there, somebody said, you have a very good memory. Why don't you try out for a game show? One of these Jeopardy-like shows. I tried out for Jeopardy. I tried out for another show, which was actually taping at the time. I did very well in the Jeopardy taping. I tried out, not in the one I wound up going on. Dick Clark was the host. And I won some money, and I decided to quit work for a while and try to read the books I hadn't read in college. And while I was doing that, I got an idea for a play, and I showed it to some friends, and they said, you seem to have a real feeling for creating characters and writing dialogue and creating suspense. So it sort of got in my head, maybe I should be a playwright. And I didn't actually do it for a number of years, but eventually it led to my being a playwright. So in a weird way, Los Angeles played a role in that.
Oh, bravo. Do you have the episode recorded that you
do in VHS, a 12th century technology?
Oh, you have to get it, transcribed. We definitely want to see this. So I got to tell you, I'm kind of early on in the days before everyone had smartphones. People said, "Oh, ask Randy," because I just I accumulate facts, many of them useless, whatnot. So I, had a good memory. I tried out for Jeopardy twice on trips to LA, and I did fine. I made the practice round both times. Right. They started with huge auditorium,
yeah,
I did like 300 or 400 people applying, huge line outside, and they wind up picking, I don't know, like out of 5% of those, and then only certain, anyway, but I never got called back. And I did get called back from some other show, and I was going to meet them, but then the show went out, but it was another kind of game show. And so I had that image or that ideal to do in my head, but it never came to fruition. So one of my close buddies at the time, he did it, and he was out there. He won his first day. I think he just won one day, but we watched that over and over again. It was a big joy. Anyway, so what had been your line of work? So we both went to Yale, and then what happened next in your pathway? I guess occupationally, or on between this and that, and how have things molded along, and where do you see your next steps?
I've been a school teacher off and on. I've also worked for several banks, not as a banker, but as a corporate writer. I was an editor at an alternative newspaper. I had different kinds of jobs. And sometimes been a full-time writer, though sometimes it was ghostwriting. So, it's been a variety of different occupations.
Do you recommend, what's your advice to somebody who comes out of college and is like, oh, I want to be a writer. I want to be like him. What do you think the pathway is? Or is it something open to everybody, or how do you figure that out?
Yeah, it's not easy. One of the problems of the business is that the way to get entry into it is to go through a writing program, whether something like the Iowa Writers Conference or one of these graduate playwriting programs. But these programs actually homogenize the writers that they perform, and they take away a lot of what's distinctive and interesting about them. And of course, they don't have, when they start writing, they don't have any of their own life experience. So they don't really have anything that is terribly compelling from the point of view of the reader. But that's how you get an agent, and it's very important to get an agent when you're starting out. So I think it's a problem.
So do you have an agent?
Yeah, a book agent, a fantastic agent, best agent I've ever had. My theater agent does nothing, but I'm not supposed to say that on camera. Yes, I shouldn't have said that, but I have a fantastic agent.
We can theoretically edit that if you choose.
Yeah.
So speaking of editing, in the play process, how does your play go from start to finish? How much editing is there once it's, say, originally hits being a play? Is it a continual work of iteration?
Yeah. What's
that process been like for you? And say, can you give us just kind of a capsule, as much as you can, start to finish, from idea stage to, this is done and it's getting applause?
Well, you always think when you've finished, it was the first draft of the 66th draft, but before you've started working with actors, you always think, this time I got it right. I know this is going to work. But then when you start working with actors, you realize a lot of things don't work, and you have to start making changes. And a lot of times actors can be very helpful. I think you get feedback with theater. You get feedback from three categories of people: the actors, the director, and once you start actually getting produced, the producers. And usually the best advice comes from the actors, because actors, there are many people who don't respect actors' intelligence, but almost all good actors have an enormous amount of understanding of the psychology of their own characters and the motivation of their own characters. They have an intuitive understanding of this that can be very profound. And when they give you criticisms, they say, well, I don't think my character would do this, or I don't understand why I'm saying this. They're asking very, very meaningful questions that you have to really think about. I should add also the audience, because once you start doing staged readings, or even you get into previews, you're getting feedback from the audience. And one of the pieces of advice I would give to any playwright is always sit in the back of the audience, because you can watch the audience. The audience is in a way more important. They're telling you much more important things than the actors are. The audience is telling you when they're paying attention and not paying attention.
Does that lead to your clipping, cutting, moving pieces?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have an old expression in the theater, the audience is always right. And I think there's probably a fair amount of truth to it. Maybe I just have pedestrian taste. I don't know, but I haven't often been to a play where I thought the audience was completely wrong. Very rarely, very, very rarely. I mean, audiences sense a lot, just as actors sense a lot. Audiences sense a lot, and their level of attention is telling you a lot about where there are, very dead spots in the play, or things that just don't make sense.
So did you do any drama in college and high school thereafter? Have you acted?
I did. This is a story I've told more than once. I was in, most high schools do fall comedy spring musicals. So I was in this, I went to a very pretentious high school, and they did as the fall comedy, Princeton Day School in Princeton, New Jersey. Okay. So they did as the fall comedy, Bertolt Brecht's The Good Woman of Szechuan.
Right.
And a very funny, and it's not a comedy. And I played the villain, this capitalist villain, and people really liked me. And In fact, I got a standing ovation in the middle, or a big ovation in the middle of the scene, which doesn't, high school drama, that never happens, right? Yeah, the head of the drama program said, "We want you to be in the spring musical." I can't sing. You can't. He's like, "We have to have you. You were so great. You got to be." So then I was in that, and then I was in a group of kids said they wanted to put on production Waiting for Godot, and they said, we really like you in it. And I thought that was I'd done enough acting at that point. That was plenty of acting. And my brother came to see me when I was freshman at Yale. A poster for auditions for a production of another Beckett play called Endgame. And he said, everybody loved you in that Beckett play. Why don't you try out for this? I said, well, I'm not really passionate about acting. It's not that, not a big deal. He said, no, everybody really liked it. Why don't you try it? So I wound up in this play at Yale, and there were a couple of people in it. Some of the people in it were great, but there were a couple of people involved in the production they were what we would call theater types. And they were very phony and annoying. And I won't get into all of that, but I thought I'll never have anything to do with theater again. That's it. I'm done with theater. So it was kind of a shock to me some years later to suddenly realize, oh wait, I've gotten dragged back in. But that's what happened.
What's the impulse to be? There has to be the drag or the dragee. What's the impulse to be dragged back? How did you let yourself? I suppose you're both sides of that equation. I realized I had some talent at it, and other people, when I showed them things I'd been writing, they said, "Gee, you seem to have some talent for this." And I was living in New York. I think if I'd been living in Los Angeles, I would have gone into writing screenplays or TV scripts. Just happened I was living in New York, so great place. Are you? What borough do you live in?
I live in Manhattan now, though. I've lived in Queens and Brooklyn too.
And does harmony exist in the Leaf household as, with your playwriting? I mean, I have my own personal handcuff here. I love it. It's made out of gold. I never take it off. But there are some exigencies of domestic life that require money. And
my wife is very supportive, but I also do make a living. I do one way or another. I seem to make a living, but my wife is very supportive. My wife's terrific. I've been very glad.
Perfect. So let's get back to your book and what prompted that? Where the idea form? How does one think? Oh, I have never done this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do a mystery. What's the I guess the animating force of the genesis?
Yeah, I mean, it was when I picked up books about the movie business in LA. They really didn't seem to capture the movie business or LA. I'm talking about recent books because there are some real classics if you go way back. Obviously, Day of the Locust, The King of the West, and Notes Lines well known. Absolutely fantastic. The short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, this collection he wrote called the Pat Hobby Stories that are about the movie business. They're dynamite. But when I read recent stuff, including by people who've been in the movie business, it just didn't ring true. I mean, I think that they instinctively fell back on cliches about the movie business instead of actually, and they didn't really, as I say, they didn't describe what actors and writers really go through. They didn't really capture the experiences. So I had a desire to write such a book, and then the COVID pandemic happened, and I was stuck at home for some months and decided to write this book.
Lovely. And how do you stress test it?
I did. I showed it to friends, and they were very helpful. One in particular, a guy named John Craig, gave me some very good advice about a couple of plot points. They said, this is not what this character would do. This character would do this, or you have to clarify this, and it really improved the book. In fact, I wasn't crazy about the book until I heard John's criticism, and then I made the changes. I was like, wow, that's a lot better. Well, that was very helpful. But it is loosely based. I don't want to get myself sued, but it is loosely based on quite a few actual incidents and people.
Good point. So I won't ask who, how, when, or why. So let me ask you, who's your favorite character in the book?
I don't know. Most people think Claire is kind of awful in some ways, but there's, she has such chutzpah that I find her, in some ways, I find her kind of attractive. And I showed the book to a well-known screenwriter. I won't mention his name. But a guy who wrote movies for Tom Cruise and Will Smith and so forth. And he said she was his favorite character in the book. So I know that's not instinctively what most people think. I've heard from people who've read the book since it came out that they really find, they start off disliking Vincenza, but they really come to like her by the end of the book, which makes sense. I mean, she's a much more sympathetic character.
I kind of like the police guy. A small role. And Billy's interesting, right? I mean, I assume you're Billy.
A little bit. I mean, I'm older. I'm not physically like Billy. Maybe a little bit. Yeah, I mean, definitely. There are some experiences he has where he's trying to get people interested in his writing, and there are definitely experiences that I've had that are similar to his.
So, is there a modern day book tour these days, and people do that, or is it all kind of happening online or virtually?
Less and less. I mean, I have friends who have recently been on book tours, but they're less and less. It seems to be disappearing as a phenomenon. A friend told me just a few days ago, I can mention her name, Lauren Willig. Was a lovely person as well as a pretty successful writer. She's had several New York Times bestsellers. And she told me, including a very recent one called Band of Sisters, she told me that she was brought by her publisher, HarperCollins, along with 5 other writers, one of whom they'd flown down from Canada for an event in New Jersey, and there was literally no one there. Not one person there. Reader, that is.
Yeah, that's kind of sad, huh? I
did well, so apparently this wasn't meaningful. I don't know.
I already mentioned to you, and I have a book comes also. I'm just going to pop it up here for a second. So I have a book overturning Zika, and Zika's it's kind of getting down the memory hole now. People don't necessarily remember it, and what it is. Mosquito might help, although I've been telling people lately that's my self-portrait. It's my author portrait on the front of the book. That's not quite true, but it's going down. So I have not been able to get an agent. I've not been able to do that stuff, but I am being published in Brazil. So one of the things, I'm not saying it's a smart thing, but one of the things I did was when I wrote the book, I hired translators in Spanish and Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese in particular, to translate. And so I don't have the Spanish edition out yet, but if there's success with the one in Brazil, then we might do one for Colombia, potentially Mexico, whatever. And I think they still in Brazil have much more affinity towards books and bookstores, from my understanding anyway. So whether material, whether a book tour or a launch or whatever materialize, I don't know. I mean, obviously there's some travel agencies because I don't live in Brazil, and I don't speak Portuguese. I don't speak Brazilian Portuguese. So, but I kind of in my mind, I have this idealized concept of that, of having something like that, or at least getting on a TV talk show. But in the end, I will need some interlocutor to kind of help me punch up to my weight. I do speak some Spanish, reasonable Spanish. We'll see where that goes. But it's kind of been a little bit of a tough slog. I'll just tell you, my book, there already was a Zika book out there from 2016. It's written by Donald McNeil, the erstwhile chief science writer for the New York Times, who, if Schadenfreude is a real thing, or karma or whatever, he got woke canceled by the mob at the New York Times and other places. I don't know how these things percolate up, but he was found for some years prior to have used the N-word, but said it out loud because he was asked in context. I think he was in Peru or something like that. They're like, "What's up with this? Why can one group of people say this word and the other group of people can't?" And so he was talking about that. He's in the meta sensibility. So I don't blame. I don't blame him for saying what he said, but somehow there's a tape of it that showed up, and the New York Times initially defended him, and then they dropped him. Anyway, he's got a Zika book, and he was, in a sense, the actor that, kind of swirled this milkshake up, or maybe cotton candy is a better thing. That's kind of whipped confection, which when you kind of look at it, disappears. And Zika supposedly causing microcephaly, which is small heads in babies, in Brazil in 2015, and never recurred anywhere on Earth as a concept. In order for science to happen, it has to be A and B. So I have this tissue I drop, and it always goes down. So A, B, and A, B. So science is kind of like reproducible. You do this thing over and over again. Everything happens. It starts going up because something else happened. So the Zika microcephaly hypothesis was that A causes B, Z causes N, Zika causes microcephaly, and never recurred, period. His book, was one who generated the CDC to get on this. He gave people top billing in the New York Times. He got a fair amount of bully pulpit to do it, but he didn't. Once he lost the pulpit, he didn't actually lose the bully part. So when I told him what I wanted to write, which is that I don't think this was a real thing, he bullied me and told me that that I probably could get it published because of my medical background, but I'd be wasting my time. I forget exactly, but basically it would be bad thing if I did, because etc. Anyway, so there's part of this whole kind of narrative that happens. So he had no problem getting his book published, although there's a reasonable exegesis of what occurred, but it's not at all critical of the quote unquote science underlying, of which there was really none. And so here's a question I have is, if you're not part of the narrative, do you get published? Do you get popularized? And how hard is it to get reviews and so forth? I've found it sort of an uphill struggle. I can get nobody within the infectious disease community. Yeah, I hate that word, but because I don't think people. Well, maybe they are a community, but you can't break through. Maybe they're a community in the sense that wagon trains, circle, and they circle the wagons. They kind of insulate away some of those little doodle bugs fold in upon themselves. So I have not found anybody within the medical establishment, practically, aside from Dr. J. Bhattacharya, who gave a thumbs up to my critique, whatnot, to do this. So for you, is it hard to get your book, which might be critical of some of these processes in LA, and some of your perspective, which I think are not necessarily of the left and whatnot? How does that work for you? Are you swimming upstream?
Well, mostly that's a first novel, but I've written for a lot of magazines. If you've written for a lot of magazines, you can call magazine editors and say, "Would you review my book?" So I've done that, and we're waiting for reviews from a bunch of different magazines. As mentioned, already been reviewed a number of places. But what's difficult, I think, for you is that it sounds like you're writing. I would recommend you maybe start trying to see if you can write for something like The Federalist. That would do a lot if you're going to write that book or subsequent books. The more you write for magazines, if you define yourself as a medical professional who has medical knowledge and is critical of establishing thinking on these subjects, The Federalist, Spectator USA, a lot of these kinds of publications. Then when you have a book out, you can call your editors and say, "Please review it. Can you have somebody review it?" Which doesn't assure a good review, but it does mean that you'll get a certain amount of attention, which is critical. And then that can lead to, you're being asked to be on TV to talk about these issues.
Well, so I've written for the Washington Examiner. I've written for the Daily Skeptic. I've written for Brownstone.
Yeah.
And, so there's that. That's a good idea. I'll try to circle around.
Did you ask the Washington Examiner to review your book about Zika?
No, I didn't. I had an article about the Zika vaccine. They're actually literally injecting and infecting young women in Baltimore with Zika as we speak, generally speaking. For the last year or so, they've been doing this in hopes of getting a Zika vaccine and then presumably promulgating it worldwide and mandating it or mandating it for 1 billion people on a regular basis. So it's a huge, Zika has not been monetized yet. And although, A doesn't cause B, Zika, in my view, very firmly, Zika does not cause microcephaly, and it hasn't anywhere on Earth in the last 8 years. I think they're going to have a vaccine. They're going to put it out. They're going to tell everyone to take it. And once that happens, they're going to declare victory. Oh my God, there's no more microcephaly, when there hasn't been. So I'm hoping to engage RFK Jr.'s Children's Health Fund and others to kind of head them off, getting back to state wagon trains and whatnot, to head them off at the pass, as we say from cowboy movies, to head off the WHO slash, some of the vaccine actors. I think in this case, Takeda, Sanofi, Moderna, from trying to monetize this thing, which is not a crisis. But as long as it's in the narrative, so my book is, I'm kind of the kid in the Emperor's New Clothes. I'm like the people who are in the coterie, who are a part of this, nearly $1 billion research industry of hunting down, Zika, microcephaly, and whatnot, and Zika had never caused a single human illness ever till that point. So they're all hunting this down. That they just can't, get up from, hunting to look around and say, oh my God, the war's over. There was nothing here. So it's a weird thing. I'm the one who's like, let's look back at the origins. So I went back to the origin story. So I don't want to confuse this because, my kind of literary pathway is, I had kind of a real kernel, a real genesis of what I had to write. Whereas you're dealing in creation, maybe more, literally, you're coming up with characters and people and whatnot. So, how does that, I'm just curious about the process. How does that percolate? And, when did you see yourself as kind of the writer type per se, as opposed to doing these other things?
I don't know the answer to that. For many years when I was, I had very little or no attention as a writer, was, writing on my own. People would ask me whether I was a writer, and I'd say no. I think until you start getting paid for it, maybe you're not a writer. But, that's an opinion that other people will disagree with. And I suppose there have been great writers who made almost no money from their writing. So, I'm not fully qualified to say. But I don't make a distinction between, writers of fiction and nonfiction that much. Hopefully you have something to say and you have a story. And that's true whether you're doing fiction or nonfiction. I mean, one of my absolute favorite writers is Tom Wolfe. And I think he was best.
He might be literally my favorite writer.
Yeah, I think he was best of all, maybe as a nonfiction writer, but whether he was writing fiction or nonfiction, he was telling his story. And he had something to say.
He actually, I'm not sure, I can't say directly I was inspired unless I somehow remembered it, muscle memory. But a lot of his books, he would immerse himself in the crowd, and he would take, a tape recorder before he had smartphones, and record people. So for, I think I Am Charlotte Simmons, he went to colleges and talked with kids, sat down, whatever, and he got the conversation. So with a lot of that, the dialogue, he didn't just make up whole cloth. He's working through. He's kind of figuring it out, figuring it in to the pieces. And I think that brings, a fair amount of the mastery to it.
I heard him talk on a number of occasions. I had an opportunity to meet him and really meet him in person once, and I kind of, let's get on good heart. But I heard him talk once. He was talking about, he's a great friend of Gay, what's his name? Talese. And he talked about an article that Gay Talese had written about Sonny Liston. And Sonny Liston had written an article where he'd hung out with Sonny Liston and his wife for a number of days. And he got these quotes from Sonny Liston's wife where she said, Sonny, you were a young man when we got on the plane in Los Angeles. We got off in New York. You're an old man. You're walking around like an old man. And she's saying all these things that, people don't normally say in front of reporters. And he said that he thought that Gay Talese had made up the quotes. And then he realized he met Gay Talese and he got to see what he was doing. And he realized, no. He had exactly as you're saying. He had just managed to completely ingratiate himself with these people and mesh himself with these people. And he just heard what they said to each other. And that's what made the article so interesting. And then he decided, I'm going to try and be that kind of reporter.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I mean, I have my other books I have in the galleys, as it were. I have a book which I actually wrote in 2012 called, now it's called Withdraw to Freedom. It's about how to get out of the opiate addiction maze. And I I didn't wind up publishing it. Long story. I mentioned some of it to you earlier, but I've kind of had a hiatus in my medical career, and that put this on the shelf. But I during COVID, I started writing, in silver lining within the cloud, I guess. And I went back. I'm not saying I was directly inspired, but when I started writing that book, I tried to get publishers. I did all these things, trying to get agents, all this stuff. And I had the book pretty much done for that time, and it couldn't get published, and I didn't have a name. I wasn't Dr. Phil, Dr. Drew, Dr. Oz, any of that. I was Dr. Me, and I didn't have a name. So they weren't interested in it, and they said, you have to kind of, basically before Substack or whatever they need, and they basically said you have to promote it and make it so big that everyone has to read it. So that hasn't happened. But at some point I said, I'm going to get the stories from the people themselves, because like Art Linklater said, kids say the darndest things. Well, so too did this is like about 40% of my practice at the time, because it was this Suboxone oriented narcotic de-addiction to sobriety. People told me incredible stuff, and I a lot of it just kind of went by. But I had a smartphone at the time, a new iPhone, and I asked them permission if I could record them and put it up for other narcotic addicts, have from which to learn. And everyone's very generous when they're on the pathway to recovery. They're so happy, especially from where they were to where they're going, that they were, joyed about it. And I got releases and had them sign, everything like that. I've taken those videos off, but they're hugely instructive. So sometimes the actual people in those processes have a lot more to say. And we, as maybe the writers and so forth, have an obligation to bring the voice to them. So I made a channel on YouTube called Get Your Life Back, and I had to take it down because of my own issues. One of the narcotic addicts kind of went vituperative, vengeful, whatnot, and made a false complaint about me. It took me a long time to clear that up. So that all went down in the interim. But there's something there. If you can get actual stories out, and some. I think there's always going to be the editorial hand in how they get produced. But so be it. Anyway, we're rounding out towards the end of the hour, really fast. I'd like to kind of talk less. I apologize for talking too much. But tell us a little about maybe what your next endeavors might be. What are you working on? What are your advice to other writers? And where are your inspirations currently?
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about this, but I've been working for quite some time with my agent on a book about human evolution. It's you could call it pop science. It's popular. Well, it has some of my own ideas, but mostly it's other people's ideas. There's been a vast amount of research in recent years in neuroscience and biochemistry showing that the human brain is not much like that of a chimp or gorilla, which makes sense because our evolution is completely different. Our behavior is completely different. And the book is about this, and it's about how humans seem to share more in common with creatures like elephants and dolphins and even dogs than we do with chimps and gorillas. So it's criticizing a lot of ideas that have been widely accepted, but which don't make a lot of sense, and for which there's very little evidence, actually, I might add. So busy with that. Advice for other writers, I don't know. I think it's difficult, but if I were to give advice to you, I would say you want to get published as much as you can, even the left-wing press like The Nation, but publish, The Federalist. Try to write, even if it's online, try to write for different, as a scientist, as a doctor, you have a lot of expertise, and people are probably going to be interested in your opinions about things like Zika and porn addiction. I have a brother friend who's quite politically reactionary say it was only liberals who could come up with methadone maintenance treatment because it's addiction that's not fun.
It's hate our feet.
And it's interesting. I'd have to assess that one out in a little. I've got my own thoughts on methadone. And so I'm happy to share with you my book. If you have absolutely nothing else to do with your time, I can show you some bits of it on the Withdraw to Freedom book. I might start to release that in serial form. A lot of the great writers like Dickens and Conan Doyle wrote in serial. Right. Had not Quaker Oats or Lucky Charms. I mean the other type of cereal. And I think it was that you were getting at earlier, the Samuel Johnson quote, nobody writes cut for money. which is not the way we'd say things these days. But if you're not getting paid for it, no, you're not a writer. I've used that criterion.
I was just saying, to describe yourself as a writer when you haven't been published or you haven't made any money out of it, it seemed to me...
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like, hello, I'm your actress tonight. What would you like from the menu? It's like,
Exactly.
tonight you're the waitress or the server, something like that sort. And we'll get to whether you're can be an actor or not. And yes, we all have aspirations, but those often take perspiration, of which many people don't necessarily want to exert. So I have to say, that the book, getting my idea. So I had written some other things prior. So looking back, I could just kind of bubble up memory. I've written for this Kevin MD site, which is a medical site, proximity, and but in order to get a book out, you have to actually have a lot more work on it. So it's kind of an order of magnitude, more effort. So I commend you for that. So if people want to get hold of you, where can they find you, and where do you get your ideas from, and what do you rely on?
Well, they can contact me through my website, actually. And occasionally people do. I've had conversations with people all over the world that never met, which is interesting. By the way, if you do get your book published in Portuguese and you go down to Brazil, you're gonna find a fantastic experience. I've never been to Brazil, but getting a play produced in France was an amazing experience. I don't know French. My wife is French American, but I don't know French, so she had to do all the talking. But it was just to go to another country and have people laugh or respond to your writing. It's a great experience. It's wonderful. Yeah. So I don't know. I think I only answered half the question. I'm forgetting what the rest of the question.
That's fine. We're good. I'll just show people. Here's your Twitter feed. Writer John Leaf, like a piece of a tree, and here's your webpage. And I think we covered over where to buy the book, some of the reviews, so we're City of Angles. And I recommend it to people. And here's my book, and so forth. So thank you so much for this. Any closing words?
Thank you, and I hope people buy the book. We keep hearing over and over again from people is that above all else, they thought it was a really fun read.
Yeah, no, I see that, and I second it, and I just finished it actually last night, so it's fresh in my mind. I think the really interesting part for me is kind of the machinations, deliberations, and the kind of cross currents of the Hollywood-ish acting world. In this case, confluent with, I guess a Scientology-like group. So there's a lot of intrigue there. So people can find it, as we've mentioned. Thank you so much, Jonathan. You and I can chat for a second after this, but I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thank you for listening.